The blackwood thicket held its breath, a vast, oppressive expanse of skeletal maples and defiant pines, whose lower boughs were already sheathed in a brittle, crystalline glaze of impending winter. It was a place defined not by what lived within its borders, but by what the surrounding villages feared might be listening. The air itself was thin, a stinging draught that offered no warmth, only the promise of deeper, irreversible cold. Elias Vance, 18 years old and carrying the cumulative weight of a decade of institutional abandonment, pressed his back against the rough, fissured bark of an ancient oak, trying to merge his threadbare form with the immovable geometry of the forest. His hunger was no longer a sharp pang. It had devolved into a dull, corrosive emptiness, a constant churn beneath his ribs that stole the necessary energy to even shiver effectively. The local legends had christened the structure deep within this unforgiving maze the Hush Cabin. It was whispered that those who sought shelter there found only eternal silence. The terror was amplified by its singular, confounding architectural peculiarity. It possessed no doors. None had ever been carved, none boarded up. The logs rose seamlessly from the damp earth to the eaves, a perfect, impenetrable box of rough-hewn timber, save for the single, ominous column of its chimney stack that pierced the slate roof like a broken tooth. Elias had been driven to this point of ultimate absurdity by the absolute failure of all rational options. He had exhausted the generosity of the nearby farms, a threadbare resource even in kinder seasons. He had slept in ditches, under culverts, and in the frigid, echoing hollowness of abandoned barns, until the scent of his despair became too potent for the surviving rats to ignore. Now, the early evening light was fading, leaching the last vestige of color from the sky and leaving behind a cold, bruised purple that promised a hard frost, capable of stealing the breath right out of a man's lungs. He pushed himself away from the oak, the friction generating a painful scrape against his already irritated skin. His gaze fixed upon the cabin, perhaps 50 yards distant, barely visible through the curtain of stripped branches. It was a monolith of decay, squatting low against the forest floor, its profile utterly defiant in its lack of ingress. The fear that clung to the local populace was understandable. A house without a door was an insult to human nature. It suggested a permanence, a finality that defied the very concept of habitation. But Elias was beyond the luxury of superstition. He quantified things purely by physical necessity. The structure was wood. It offered potential shelter from the gathering ice. The legends spoke of fear, not of tangible danger, and Elias had learned that the human heart held a far greater capacity for immediate, personal cruelty than any ghostly apparition. He began his approach, each step a calculated expenditure of precious, irreplaceable energy. The ground beneath the thin soles of his boots was already hardening, the damp leaves crunching with the brittle snap of ice forming beneath the surface layer. The cold permeated his worn coat, finding the gaps in the fabric, seeping into the core of his being. As he drew closer, the details of the cabin sharpened into grim focus. The logs were dark, almost black, saturated with the moisture of countless seasons and scarred by lichen the color of dried blood. The windows, two on the visible side, were small, murky rectangles, thick with grime and cobwebs, offering no glimpse of the interior, only reflecting the dying light back as a pale, indifferent sheen. He skirted the perimeter slowly, dragging his fingertips across the rough surface of the logs. The wood felt dense, cold, and utterly solid. There was no seam, no break in the pattern of the overlapping timber that suggested a door had once been there and had been removed. It was built, fundamentally, as a vault. He reached the backside of the structure, where the tall, imposing chimney stack rose. It was constructed of fieldstone, mortared crudely, suggesting it was an addition or perhaps built slightly separately from the log body itself. The stones were black, stained by the decades of smoke and precipitation. Elias looked up. The mouth of the chimney stack was perhaps 30 feet above him. It seemed impossible. He was weak. His arms felt like water. His coordination had been degraded by the persistent fog of caloric deficit. Yet, if he did not find shelter, the next 6 hours would extinguish him completely. The urgency was a crushing physical pressure in his chest, forcing the decision. He tested the rough stone surface near the base. The mortar was old, cracked, and porous, enough to provide fingertip purchase, perhaps, if he was utterly focused and utterly desperate. He shed the only thing he possessed that might impede him, the heavy, threadbare woolen blanket he wore beneath his coat. It fell silently to the frozen earth, a small, dark sacrifice. He flexed his hands, trying to summon warmth to his chilled, stiffened fingers. The skin on his knuckles was stretched taut and painfully dry. The climb began with a single, tentative reach. His fingers hooked onto a protrusion of jagged mortar. He shifted his weight, testing the hold. It held. A wave of lightheadedness, brought on by the sudden exertion, washed over him, momentarily blurring his vision. He steadied himself, taking slow, deliberate breaths, the frigid air searing his throat. The upward trajectory was slow, measured by inches. He moved with the precision of someone who understood that a single slip meant not just a painful fall, but likely the end of his short, hard existence. The stone was abrasive, scraping the skin off his palms and forearms where they brushed against the rough surface. He felt the minute grit of the old mortar crumbling beneath the pressure of his boot toes. He focused entirely on the immediate geometry of the wall, the next crevice, the next protruding stone, the next necessary pivot. The world narrowed to this vertical ascent, the cold biting at his exposed neck and wrists, but his mind a surgical instrument, rejecting the pain in favor of the immediate physical necessity. Higher up, the chimney narrowed slightly, and the residue of the past became overwhelming. He entered the band of thick, oily black soot, a residue of countless fires that had burned and died within the cabin. This grit coated everything. Fine as flour, but staining deep into his clothes and skin. It invaded his nostrils, causing him to suppress a hacking cough that threatened to break his rhythm and send him plunging downward. The smell was ancient, a blend of wood smoke, dampness, and something metallic, perhaps the residual scent of iron pots and forgotten fires. The silence of the woods below seemed to press up against him, amplifying the scraping sounds of his boots and the ragged intake of his own breath. He was halfway up now, the ground a dizzying distance below, looking deceptively soft. He could not look down. He locked his gaze on the dark, yawning mouth of the chimney crown above. His arms were screaming, muscles seizing with fatigue and cold. The weight of his own body felt monumental. He paused, resting his cheek against the cold stone, trying to gather the strength for the final push. His grip was weakening. He could feel the fine, involuntary trembling that meant he was nearing failure. He forced himself onward, summoning a reserve of desperate energy fueled purely by the image of the paralyzing frost waiting on the ground. He hauled himself over the final lip of stone, his chest scraping painfully across the sharp edge of the chimney crown. He lay there for a moment, prone on the narrow ledge, catching his breath, tasting the acrid soot mixed with his own sweat. The effort had been tremendous, leaving him spent and shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the exertion and the immense, terrifying height. Carefully, he began the descent into the flue. The chimney shaft was an utterly dark, suffocating vertical tube. The soot here was thicker, a velvety accumulation of years. He began to slide down, bracing his elbows and knees against the inner walls to control the speed of his drop. The darkness was absolute, pressing against his eyes. 1 foot. His boot met solid material below. He was in the firebox. Standing on a bed of cold, compacted ash and cinders, he paused, heart hammering against his ribs, listening. The silence inside the hushed cabin was startlingly different from the silence of the woods. Outside, the silence felt vast and external, dominated by the frozen air and the distant whisper of the wind through the pines. Inside, the silence was thick, close, and intimate. Pressing into the drum of his ears, it was the silence of deep abandonment, of sealed space. Elias waited for his eyes to adjust, even though the light source was minimal, only the dim shafts filtering through the grime-caked windows. Slowly, shapes began to coalesce in the oppressive gloom. He stepped out of the fireplace, his boots crunching loudly on the dry, brittle remnants of the hearth. He was inside the doorless cabin. The single room was dominated by the overwhelming smell of dust and stagnant air. It was a dense, cloying scent, mixed with the faint residual aroma of ancient mildew and the dry decay of old wood. The structure was small, perhaps 20 feet by 20 feet. In the center stood a table, heavily built, coated in a thick, insulating layer of fine grey dust that indicated decades of undisturbed quiet. To one side, a rough-hewn bed frame, stripped of bedding, sat against the wall. A small, dark chest or trunk rested near the foot of the bed. Elias moved slowly, his senses heightened, his exhaustion temporarily forgotten, replaced by the acute awareness of being in a forbidden, sealed space. The air felt heavy, as though the oxygen had been partially consumed by the sheer passage of time. He approached the nearest window, scraping a fingernail across the thick grime. The motion revealed a small, clear patch, allowing a weak, external beam of light to slice into the room. It illuminated the motes of dust dancing in the stale air, giving the room a fleeting, illusory life. The immediate need was warmth, and then a search for sustenance. The cold inside the cabin was slightly less intense than the freezing air outside, but it was a wet, penetrating cold that promised deep chills. He turned toward the hearth. The firebox was still coated in the soot he had descended through, but scattered nearby, leaning against the stonework, were several small, dry pieces of kindling and a few larger splits of wood, surprisingly preserved by the dryness inside the sealed structure. Hope, a feeling Elias had long thought extinct within him, flared weakly in his chest. But starting a fire required ignition. He had no matches. He had no flint. He possessed only the clothes on his back, the desperate will to survive, and the knowledge of his profound helplessness. He slumped onto the dusty floor near the hearth, the exhaustion returning in a sudden, debilitating wave. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear the haze of hunger and fatigue. The silence pressed down again, heavy and unforgiving. This place, this shelter, was useless without fire. He had survived the climb, defied the warnings, only to face an internal siege by the cold. He sat for what felt like an hour, staring into the dark void of the fireplace, his mind spiraling into the familiar, corrosive abyss of self-pity and despair. His throat ached from the soot, and his stomach twisted in painful knots. Slowly, methodically, Elias began to inspect the room, prioritizing any object that might serve as a means of fire or sustenance. He started with the rough table. Its surface was perfectly smooth beneath the dust. He ran his hand across the edge, feeling for any hidden compartments or loose joints. Nothing. Next, the bed frame. It was massive, constructed of thick oak, designed to last generations. He ran his hands along the posts, checking for carvings or storage areas. Beneath the frame, the floorboards were visible. They were wide, old pine, darkened by age. He moved to the small wooden trunk near the foot of the bed. It was heavy, made of dark, unvarnished wood, perhaps cedar, banded with rusted iron strips. The lid was secured by a heavy, complex latch. He tried to pry it open with his stiff fingers, but the mechanism was locked tight, solid and unyielding. Frustration surged, hot and fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold, rational need to continue searching. The key was unlikely to be near the lock. He stood up, looking critically at the walls. They were sealed tight. He ran his hand over the seams of the logs, searching for any break in the construction. The work was expertly done. The logs were tightly joined, sealed against the elements. He walked over to the opposite wall, inspecting a crude wooden shelf fixed high up, just below the roof rafters. It held nothing but a few scraps of ancient cloth and a couple of thick ceramic bowls, inverted and thick with dust. He felt the familiar claw of panic beginning to tighten around his lungs. He had to find something. He returned to the center of the room, focusing on the floor. It seemed the most likely place for a hidden space. The floorboards were wide and heavy, fitted tightly together. Elias knelt, dragging his nails along the gaps between the boards, following the lines meticulously. The dust offered no clues. It lay uniformly across the surface. He paused near the area between the table and the hearth. Here, the wood seemed slightly darker, perhaps more compressed. He pressed down with his entire body weight onto one particular board, just shy of 3 feet long. It did not give, but his touch revealed a subtle shift in texture. He pressed harder, listening intently. A faint dry creak resonated in the overwhelming silence. This board was not entirely secured. Elias rose, looking around for a tool. There was nothing, no poker, no shovel, no loose piece of metal. He was forced to rely on pure leverage and persistence. He located the narrowest point of the seam near the wall and began to work the edge of his boot heel into the crack. The leather was worn but strong. He pushed, grunting with the effort, the muscles in his legs coiling tight. The board stubbornly resisted. He tried again, shifting his weight, using the full momentum of his body. The wood protested, letting out a louder, more agonizing screech. Finally, the edge of the board lifted by a fraction of an inch. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the biting cold of the floor. His fingers, already raw, found the thin gap. He hooked the tips of his fingers under the lip and pulled with slow, agonizing pressure, fighting the suction of decades of settled dust and damp. The board reluctantly ceded, tearing away from the neighboring pieces with a sound like ripping sailcloth. It was heavy. He lifted it entirely and set it carefully aside. A dark, square cavity was revealed beneath, about 1.5 feet deep. Elias leaned over the hole, inhaling the scent that wafted up, a dry, musty odor mixed with the strange, sweet fragrance of preserved paper. Inside the cavity, resting on the compacted earth, was a single object, a heavy, wrought-iron box. It was perhaps 12 inches square and 6 inches deep, completely unmarked by corrosion despite its age. It possessed a powerful gravity, a visual weight that instantly conveyed its importance. His hands trembled violently as he reached in. The iron was icy cold to the touch, grounding him instantly. He pulled the box free and set it on the dusty floorboards. It was sealed with an integral lock, recessed into the metal. There was no keyhole visible on the exterior, only a small, almost invisible rectangular indentation on the top surface. Elias stared at the box, the immediate panic of cold and hunger momentarily suspended by the sheer mystery of the object. Why seal a doorless house just to hide a box? He ran his fingers over the indentation, seeking a pressure plate or a release mechanism. Nothing happened. He lifted the box, testing its weight. It was substantial, heavier than its size suggested, filled with solid contents. He returned his attention to the surrounding area. He inspected the earthen floor beneath the cavity and the underside of the floorboard he had removed. Nothing. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the room again, looking for any other unusual item, any small discarded piece of metal that might serve as a key or a tool. His eyes fell upon the hearth again. The cold, black throat of the chimney. He had ascended through it. He walked back to the fireplace, the urgency of discovery now eclipsing the sheer necessity of survival. He reached into the deep recesses of the firebox, plunging his hands into the oily, clinging soot and ash. He searched for anything, a stray tool, a forgotten poker, a discarded piece of metal. His fingers scraped against the rough stone of the interior wall, then snagged on something small, metallic and smooth, tucked tightly into a seam between the stones, just above where the main body of the fire had once burned. He carefully pulled it out. It was a small, crudely fashioned iron spike, tapered to a fine point, perhaps 4 inches long. It wasn't a key. It looked more like a heavy nail or a specialized tool. It was entirely clean of soot on one half, suggesting it had been deliberately inserted and protected. He carried it back to the iron box, his breath held tight in his chest. He examined the indentation again. It was exactly the shape of the clean end of the iron spike. With a profound sense of inevitability, Elias inserted the tip of the spike into the rectangular slot. It slid home perfectly, the contact creating a faint, high-pitched thunk. He pushed the spike downward. It resisted momentarily, then depressed with a sharp, resonant click that echoed unnaturally loud in the sealed space. He withdrew the spike. The lid of the box, previously seamless, now had a fine, almost invisible line running along its edge. He placed his thumbs beneath the edge and lifted. The latch mechanism was released. The heavy iron lid swung up slowly, silently, revealing the contents. Elias gasped, a dry, choked sound. Inside, nestled against a lining of ancient, faded purple velvet, was not a cache of gold coins, nor jewels sparkling with impossible light. Instead, the box was entirely filled with paper stacks and sheaves of it, bound neatly with dry, yellowing silk ribbons. The top stack was dominated by a heavy, square envelope, sealed with a glob of brittle, dark wax, bearing an impressive, intricately carved crest. Beneath it were thick bundles of official-looking documents. It wasn't immediately apparent what this was, but the sheer volume and the meticulous care of their preservation suggested immense, non-monetary value. Elias picked up the top envelope, his fingers carefully avoiding breaking the fragile wax seal. He turned it over. Scrawled across the front in elegant looping script were the words, "To the finder, only upon entry by unorthodox means." Elias swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat unbearable. He broke the seal. It cracked and crumbled into dust at the slightest pressure, and pulled out the single sheet of heavy parchment contained within. The letter was dated 70 years prior. The script was beautiful, sharp and confident, to the soul driven by such desperation as to bypass the confines of conventional safety. The one who found the means where others only saw the end. I, Barnaby Reed, built this house as a vault, not a shelter. I was a man of great wealth, but greater paranoia. The world, I learned, desires comfort and easy access. Those who fear the effort will not touch what lies within. What you hold is not simply a record of my estate, it is the estate itself. Beneath this introductory note lie the original bearer bonds, titles to significant unburdened properties in the city of Alistair, and trust documentation for a substantial, enduring fortune. The total value is immense, secured by paper, not metal. The properties require immediate transfer of title using the provided documentation. The bonds must be deposited with the requisite banking house using the attached instructions, which detail the specific account numbers and required historical authentication. I sequestered this wealth away from my greedy, feckless kin, who only sought the path of least resistance. You, who climbed the chimney, have proven yourself willing to pay the highest price, the price of extreme effort and vulnerability, to gain access. This inheritance is legally structured to pass directly to the person who gains physical entry and retrieves this documentation. You have succeeded where all others, driven only by easy curiosity or conventional greed, have failed. This fortune belongs to you. Use it with the wisdom you earned on your way down the flue. The signature beneath was sharp and final. Elias did not move for a long time. The paper felt like a religious text in his hands. The air was still bitterly cold, the hunger still gnawed, and the dark woods still waited outside. But everything had changed. The universe had pivoted on the axis of a single, old, locked iron box. The intense urgency of fear now morphed into the overwhelming urgency of consequence. This was not a reprieve, it was a mandate. He was holding not just paper, but a massive responsibility. Failure to follow these instructions would render the immense wealth meaningless. It would decay, forgotten, just as the cabin had. He carefully placed the introductory letter aside and began, with meticulous focus, to examine the rest of the contents. The bearer bonds were the most striking, thick, beautifully engraved sheets, tied in a bundle of 200, each bearing a massive, tangible value that Elias could not begin to comprehend. They were old, but perfectly preserved, protected from the damp by the iron casing and the dry environment of the subfloor cavity. The property titles detailed several large buildings, including a historic warehouse complex near the docks of Alistair, a city Elias had only heard whispered about in the common room of the orphanages. The documentation was precise, listing the legal requirements for transfer. He realized the scale of the task ahead. This was not a matter of finding a few coins to buy a meal. This was a complete, irreversible change of status, requiring immediate, careful and precise action in a world he did not understand. The cold was biting deep now, demanding attention. He had to create warmth. He looked around the cabin with fresh eyes, seeing resources where before he had only seen obstacles. The floorboard he had removed was dry and thick. The realization struck him. The cabin's architecture was intentional. It was sealed precisely to force the entrant to bring their own means of ignition or to find the tool. The builder ensured that only someone with true, singular drive and resourcefulness could gain access, not merely someone who kicked in a door. But he still had no fire. He thought about the iron spike. It was hard, heavy iron. He needed friction. He returned to the trunk near the bed. It remained locked. He inspected the latch again, running the tip of the iron spike along the grooves. It was a complex, 5-pin tumbler mechanism, not easily picked. He pushed the trunk away from the wall. The space behind it revealed nothing. Despair threatened to return, whispering that the immediate needs, warmth, food, would kill him before the fortune could save him. Wait, the shelf. He went back to the high shelf where he had seen the ceramic bowls. He stretched, grabbing the 2 inverted bowls. He brought them down, brushing the heavy dust off their thick, heavy surfaces. He stared at the bowls. They were plain, unadorned stoneware, incredibly thick, baked hard and heavy. An idea, desperate and faint, dawned. Could he create a spark? He placed one ceramic bowl on the floor, holding it steady with his foot. He took the heavy iron spike, positioning the pointed end against the rough ceramic surface. He scraped the iron violently against the stoneware. A high grating sound filled the cabin. He repeated the motion, applying immense pressure. The iron scored the ceramic, leaving a faint grey streak, but there was no spark. He flipped the bowl over, using the smoother, fired side. Again, the iron scraped, producing a shower of fine, dark powder, but no heat. He needed something harder than the ceramic, but softer than the iron, or something that would strike the iron. He needed flint. Elias slumped back, pulling the parchment documents close to his chest. He closed his eyes, forcing his shivering body to relax, trying to think past the physical desperation. The chimney stones. He remembered the roughness of the fieldstone used in the chimney stack. That stone, mined locally, often contained veins of quartz or chert, natural flint. He returned to the hearth, reaching into the firebox again, exploring the surrounding stones. He scraped the iron spike against the rough edges of the chimney's construction. A faint but distinct clink resulted. He moved the spike lower, nearer the bed of ash, against the largest, darkest stone. Clink, clink, clack. He pressed harder, dragging the sharp point of the spike against the surface. Suddenly, a small, brilliant flash of white-hot light exploded at the point of contact, followed by the faint scent of sulfur. A spark. He needed tinder. The air was frigid, and the single board he had removed was thick, dense pine. It would not catch quickly. He looked at the shelf again. The scraps of cloth he had dismissed earlier. They were old, threadbare muslin, perfect tinder if they were dry enough. He retrieved the cloth, dry, brittle, and almost paper-thin with age. He shredded a small, fist-sized wad, creating a fluffy pile of fibers. He placed the tinder carefully on the hearth just near the dark stone he had found. He knelt, positioning the iron spike in one hand, ready to strike, and shielding the tinder with his other arm to prevent any stray breath from disturbing the placement. He began striking the stone repeatedly, focusing all his remaining energy into the downward force of the iron. Clink, flash, clink, flash. Sparks flew, small, brilliant fireworks in the gloom. Most died instantly on the cold stone, but one, larger and hotter than the rest, landed perfectly on the bed of muslin fibers. It glowed instantly, a small, angry red ember at the heart of the cloth. Elias leaned down, keeping his face clear of the fumes, and began to blow gently, consistently, his breath focused exactly on the glowing center. He had to be careful. Too much breath would extinguish it. The ember brightened, consuming the fibers, sending up a thin plume of acrid smoke. He continued to breathe shallowly, coaxing the heat. Finally, a thin yellow flame leaped up, tentative and fragile. He had fire. The immense wave of emotional relief was so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. Tears, born of pure exhaustion and relief, stung his eyes. He had beaten the cold. He quickly fed the small flame, first with the remaining muslin, then with the finest, driest splinters from the kindling pile, shielding it from the draught. The dry wood caught quickly, crackling with a joyful, aggressive sound that shattered the deep silence of the cabin. Within minutes, a genuine, strong fire was established in the hearth, sending tentative licks of warmth into the immediate vicinity. Elias sat back, watching the flames, feeling the heat sink into his chilled hands and face. The fire illuminated the room, washing away some of the oppressive gloom, pushing the shadows back into the corners. The reality of his situation, the fortune, the immediate safety, the overwhelming consequences, settled upon him with crushing weight. He needed time to process, to read every word of the complex legal documents. He needed to be secure. He turned his attention back to the iron box and the papers. He placed the heavy box near the fire, ensuring the priceless documents were warm and dry. He had one immediate, unresolved question: the locked trunk. Why had the builder left a locked trunk in a room designed to be accessed only by the resourceful? He returned to the trunk, now illuminated by the dancing firelight. He inspected the iron banding and the heavy latch again. He took the iron spike and inserted it into the small gap where the latch met the iron band. It was too thick to serve as a proper lockpick. He sat back, studying the complex design of the lock mechanism. It was deeply recessed, designed to protect the internal components. He looked back at the first letter from Barnaby Reed. With the price of extreme effort and vulnerability. The fortune was revealed by resourcefulness. Perhaps the trunk contained the tools or sustenance necessary for the journey ahead. Elias had nothing to lose. He rose, fetched the iron spike, and positioned the trunk against the solid log wall. He inserted the pointed tip of the spike into the seam between the iron band and the wooden body of the trunk, just below the lock. He took a deep breath, knowing that this was a destructive act that might ruin whatever lay inside, but survival dictated the risk. He swung the heavy iron spike upward with all his remaining strength, driving the point into the hard wood, and leveraged it violently. The wood did not splinter easily. He tried again, striking the same spot. A sound of tearing fiber echoed. He leveraged the spike down again, putting his shoulder into the motion. With a final, terrible crack, the iron band tore loose from the body of the trunk, splintering the aged cedar beneath it. The internal mechanism of the lock shrieked as the stress warped the metal. The trunk was open. Elias threw the spike aside and lifted the lid. The contents were mundane, but infinitely more valuable to his immediate survival than the bonds. The trunk contained a small store of preserved food, smoked beef jerky wrapped tightly in beeswax paper, a small bag of dried lentils, and most importantly, a heavy, tightly woven canvas pouch filled with hardened, coarse flour. Beneath the food lay a set of rudimentary tools, a sharp, small hunting knife with a bone handle, a sealed tin box containing hundreds of dry, wax-dipped matches, and a small, heavy piece of polished leather wrapped around a thick, rectangular slab of soap. Elias reached for the jerky first. His hands were shaking too violently to tear the beeswax paper cleanly. He used the newly found knife, carefully slicing through the protective wrapping. The smell of the smoked meat was overwhelming, an intense sensory assault after the long deprivation. He put a piece in his mouth. It was tough, salty, and utterly sustaining. He chewed slowly, deliberately, forcing himself to take small bites, knowing that a sudden influx of rich food could make him violently ill. As he ate, the warmth of the fire intensified, gradually chasing the systemic chill from his body. The immediate, paralyzing fear of death began to recede, replaced by a cautious, stabilizing sense of purpose. With the strength gained from the jerky and the mental stabilization provided by the knowledge of the fortune, Elias organized his findings. He had the wealth, the immediate supplies, and now the tools to safely navigate the next phase. He retrieved the matches from the tin box and secured them in an inner pocket of his coat. He would no longer rely on the chert in the chimney. He spent the remaining hours of the night reading the documentation by the flickering, growing light of the fire. He had to understand the gravity of the instructions. The documents specified that the bearer bonds required a physical presence and an authenticated signature, a signature that could be achieved by using the notary services detailed in a separate document included in the box. The primary difficulty was the journey. He had to travel to the city of Alistair, a journey of perhaps 3 days on foot through challenging terrain, especially now that the cold had intensified. The most critical document was a short, heavily coded piece of paper detailing a specific banking house in Alistair and a contact name, Mr. Silas Crowe. The document stressed that Mr. Crowe was the only person who understood the full context of the Reed estate structure and the conditions of its transfer. The sun finally began to rise, a pale, anemic light seeping through the dirty windows. Elias stood up, stretching his stiff, aching muscles. He felt physically exhausted but mentally galvanized. He had to leave the hush cabin. Staying here meant further exposure and delay. He had the food, the knowledge, and the direction. He gathered the documents, wrapping the heavy bundles in the original purple velvet lining of the iron box for protection, and then securing the whole package inside the empty flour sack found in the trunk. The package was heavy, but manageable. Before leaving, he ensured the fire was entirely out, dousing the remaining embers with the last of the dusty ash from the hearth. He replaced the cracked floorboard carefully, obscuring the hiding place completely. The cabin was left as silent and sealed as he had found it, minus the resources he had rightfully claimed. He still had the problem of the doorless structure. Climbing the chimney down was possible, but dangerous and slow. And he now carried the heavy burden of the fortune. He examined the structural integrity of the window frames. They were old, but sturdy. He took the heavy iron spike and the small knife. He carefully inserted the knife blade into the seam between the glass pane and the wooden frame of the smaller window, near the hinges. He worked slowly, gently prying the aged wood. He used the iron spike as a lever, forcing the frame away from the log wall. The wood groaned, protesting the violation, but eventually, with a sharp crack, the frame gave way. He pushed the entire frame outward. It fell into the underbrush outside with a dull thud. The opening was narrow, but large enough for him to squeeze through. He pushed the heavy sack of documents through the opening first, ensuring the fortune landed safely on the carpet of frozen leaves. Then Elias placed his hands on the sill and hauled himself through the opening. His coat snagged on a splinter of wood, but he pulled free, dropping lightly onto the cold ground outside. He stood in the cold light of dawn, breathing the sharp, clean air of the blackwood thicket. The cabin loomed behind him, its mystery broken, its purpose fulfilled. It was still doorless, still foreboding, but to Elias it was now simply a means to an end. He retrieved the sack and looked back at the immense dark forest that had sheltered him and nearly killed him. He now had the means to leave the thicket forever. Elias Vance turned his back on the hushed cabin and began the long, hard trek toward Alistair, walking with a steady, determined pace. The weight of the fortune in the sack pressed against his back, no longer a burden of fear, but a tangible promise of a future earned through vulnerability, desperation, and the immense, terrifying effort required to climb a doorless chimney into the heart of the unknown. The cold air stung his cheeks, but the core of his being held a new, fragile, yet undeniable warmth. He was no longer just the orphan, he was the inheritor. The journey had just begun, but the most difficult entrance had been achieved.